September 21st, a Bulgarian court finally reached a verdict that to many Bulgarians may have seemed like a local story, but in fact, this court case and this verdict has international significance. The court found two Hezbollah members guilty of a terrorist attack that took place in 2012, where 5 Israeli tourists were killed, along with their Muslim Bulgarian bus driver. Dozens of other people were injured in the attack. Here with us to talk about this is Toby Dershowitz, Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Strategy for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, known as FDD. FDD is a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. that is focused on national security and foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Toby.
Thanks so much for having me on your podcast, Toby.
You worked extensively on Hezbollah, criminal activities that they've done all around the world, terrorist activities. Tell us about the significance of this verdict.
Sure, Havi, I'd be glad to. First, let me just take you back to the day of the attack, right, to set the scene a little bit. It was July 18, 2012, and Israelis were vacationing in this Black seaside resort called Burgas. Burgas was relatively affordable for Israelis, and so they used to go there quite frequently. Now, on this occasion, there were 7 buses waiting for the tourists when they arrived at the Sarajevo airport. They boarded the buses in the parking lot, and then the unexpected happened, which is that a bomb that had been loaded previously onto the bus exploded, and there was blood everywhere, body parts flying everywhere. And in the end, as you mentioned, Havi, 5 Israelis and their Bulgarian bus driver were killed, and dozens were hurt in the attack. Now, there are really 2 parts to what I'm going to refer to as the investigation phase. Now, the first was an international investigation immediately following the attack, and it includes the kinds of things that would normally be included in such investigations, like forensics, where the fake IDs were made that were found. It traced telephone communications and used some of the other investigative tools that we all are familiar with. And who was involved in the investigation? Well, it was, of course, the Bulgarian government, the American government, Australian government, the Israeli government, and Canadian investigators. And I'll mention it a little bit more about that in a moment. And what did they find? They found that the attacker was killed the bomber was killed in the attack, and that the bomb was made from 3 kilos of ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate will be critical for our story. And ammonium nitrate, of course, is the explosive of choice for Hezbollah. And they found that the person who placed the bomb was working alongside 2 others, Hassan El-Hajj Hassan and Meliad Farah. Now, Hassan was a Lebanese Canadian, hence the Canadian government being involved in the investigation. And he carried a fake Michigan driver's license and was, of course, using a Canadian passport. Farah was a Lebanese Australian and carried an Australian passport and also a fake driver's license. The investigation found that these forged documents were produced in Lebanon. They've also found that the bomber was a French Lebanese, and everybody had links to Hezbollah. Now, at the time of the joint investigation, Bulgaria's Minister of Interior, Tsvetan Tsvetanov, found that the evidence linking the bombing to Hezbollah was well-founded. Europol at the time backed the conclusion, as did the others. Bulgaria was not a member of the European Union, and so the UK took the evidence and requested that the EU designate the so-called military wing of Hezbollah. Now, let's come to the second part of the investigation. While the bombing took place in 2012, the trial only began in January of 2018, and of course, that's the trial that just had the verdict.
That's a long time.
In late January, right? Exactly. So the trial had significant flaws from my perspective. First, even while the Bulgarian government, as I just mentioned, found Hezbollah financed and provided the logistics, Hezbollah was not actually mentioned or indicted in the trial. So Hezbollah itself was not on trial, even though the Bulgarian government established Hezbollah. Only the 2 individuals in their individual capacity were on trial. let me come back for 1 second to the investigation itself, the government one, because it was very significant. And it was so significant that that's what led Europe to designate what it called the military wing of Hezbollah in 2013.
To think that Hezbollah was not on trial, even though Hezbollah is the terrorist organization behind this horrific attack, is just unbelievable. But I mean, that was an international investigation, Toby. Why was this case specifically led to Europe to do this? Why is it this case?
It's a great question. Hezbollah, of course, had operated on European soil before. By the way, I should note that there was a plot to kill Israeli tourists in Bulgaria just months before. The Israelis who went skiing during the winter, but due to, let's say, advanced intelligence, became clear what was going to happen, and the plot, in fact, was foiled. I want to mention one other case that gets to what was happening in Europe at the time, and that was that in March of that year, a Cypriot court convicted Hossam Taleb Yaqub, who was a Swedish-Lebanese citizen. Now, Yaqub was arrested in Cyprus just days before the Burgas bombing, and he was charged with planning attacks also on Israeli tourists. Some of your listeners may actually remember this case because it got a good deal of media attention at the time, and what the case revealed was this massive underground operation by Hezbollah to purchase, to store, transport ammonium nitrate in Cyprus. And reports at the time indicated that the ammonium nitrate that was stored in Cyprus may have been used in the Bulgaria bombing. And again, these were not the only Hezbollah attacks, but particularly in the 1980s, there were lots of attacks on European soil. But the coming together of the Cypriot case and this case were important. So Bulgaria, for the first time, formally implicated Hezbollah. To its credit, the Bulgarian government, pursued this with great diligence under the direction of the Minister of the Interior, and the Bulgarians worked with the EU to then designate the military wing. So I think it was a convergence of all those factors that led Europe to do this.
What would that lead to? I mean, okay, now we know that they are starting to designate the military wing, the so-called military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But what are your expectations? Why is it particularly important, these new developments?
Well, it was important because, first of all, it got Europe focused on Hezbollah for doing, for engaging in these illicit activities on European soil. So it began to hold Hezbollah accountable. So I would say that's the first thing. So even though it left the door open to seeing Hezbollah as this bifurcated organization, which it isn't, the impact was still important for a number of reasons. First of all, it enabled European governments to launch these intelligence investigations in advance, right? It gave them the framework to do that. Anything that may have been tied to Hezbollah's military wing could now be investigated, and this was helpful as a deterrent. And so this would, the goal was to basically make Hezbollah, Europe, less appealing to Hezbollah. Now there were some other elements. So, for example, one was the psychological impact of this, and the idea was that it would signal that there would now be a price to pay for these kinds of malicious activities on European soil. So it went after the legitimacy of Hezbollah. And until then, Hezbollah may have felt that it could engage both in political activities and military activities, both with a sense of impunity. And let me just say one other interesting thing about the financial angle. Now, in theory, the designation could involve freezing Hezbollah assets, right? That's one of the implications of a designation. But in practice, Hezbollah was not likely going to use its military names to register its accounts. So if Hezbollah accounts were registered under political names, hypothetically, they would not be touched because of this bifurcation. But still, even with this, the designation was very important. And I'll finally just say something about the legal structure, right? So the partial designation gave the EU the legal structure to hold Hezbollah accountable. It wasn't just something that was psychological, right? So the legal structure was there, not to mention the impetus for Europe to now aggressively hold Hezbollah accountable.
We know that Hezbollah, and the Europeans know that Hezbollah is storing ammonium nitrate. There are drug dealing operations all over Europe by Hezbollah. Why only designate the so-called military wing of Hezbollah, while we know that Hezbollah is just one criminal enterprise and a terrorist organization?
Right, that's a great question. So let me approach this from two different perspectives. The first one is, does Hezbollah have a military wing and a political wing? And this is how I'd answer it. It's important for us to listen to how Hezbollah itself regards itself. And with your permission, let me just read to you just a couple of sentences, because this is how Hezbollah itself refers to itself or thinks of itself. And this is a quote from Naim Qassem, who was the second in command of Hezbollah behind Hassan Nasrallah. And he explained it very clearly. He says, if the military wing were separated from the political wing, this would have repercussions and it would reflect on the political scene. But Hezbollah has one single leadership, and its name is the decision-making Shura Council. It manages the political activity, the jihad activity, the cultural and social activities. Hezbollah's Secretary General is the head of the Shura Council and also the head of the Jihad Council. And this means that we have one leadership with one administration, end quote. Now, Naim Qassem said something else. He said, lest you think this is an aberration, he said, we don't have a military wing and a political one. We don't have Hezbollah on the one hand and the resistance party on the other. Every element of Hezbollah, from commanders to members, as well as our various capabilities, are in the service of the resistance, and we have nothing but the resistance as a priority. So these are two very explicit ways that Hezbollah's senior leadership on the record described themselves. So now I'm mindful of the other angle. Why did Europe choose to divide Hezbollah into two? And I would say there are a couple of reasons. One is, frankly, it was convenient for the EU to do that. It was thought that a full designation would have maybe precluded it from engaging with the Lebanese government, though this was certainly not the case. Also, some Europeans believe, frankly, that if it left Hezbollah alone, that Hezbollah would leave Europe alone. And that, again, certainly is not the case at all. Hezbollah actually responds to political pressure. And there's another thing, because I think it's important to understand what was their thinking. And that was the question of UNIFIL. Now, some countries thought that their participation in UNIFIL, which of course is a contingent in Lebanon of about 10,000 UN peacekeepers from about 45 countries, they thought that their own forces might be harmed, their UNIFIL forces might be harmed if Europe designated Hezbollah. Now, we can talk a lot about the effectiveness of UNIFIL against Hezbollah. That's another topic perhaps for another podcast, but suffice it to say, this was part of their calculus.
2 days before the verdict, you, Toby, wrote an opinion piece in Newsweek about the case. Can you tell us more about your piece?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason that my co-author and I wanted to publish something before the verdict, because we understood what the verdict what the results of the verdict were going to be. It was really not a great surprise. And what we wanted to do was to really set the scene for the verdict. We wanted to underscore a couple of things for the media and for others about the trial itself. First of all, the trial was a trial in absentia. So the accused were not in the courtroom, and they were not in Bulgaria. They were not physically even in the country. And we wanted to remind people that Hezbollah, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Hezbollah itself was not even mentioned in the indictment, even while the government itself had provided evidence of Hezbollah's role. And I would say even a couple of years ago, the government itself put these two individuals on its terrorism list. So, of course, I was pleased that the Prosecutor General of Bulgaria, akin to our Attorney General, he had said just weeks before that, in effect, Hezbollah was the mastermind, that it had provided the logistics and the financing. He was not actually part of the case, even though at the time that the case was unfolding, he talked about Hezbollah's role. So not being held legally accountable was my goal, to remind people in that op-ed, even while everybody knew Hezbollah itself was accountable. And I also wanted to remind people that Interpol has red notices out for the culprits, now the convicted. And it's important to underscore that because Interpol has an important role in this case. So even while the verdict ended up being life in prison without parole and payment to the victims' families, I'm just wondering if justice will ever be done given the circumstances.
I wanted to ask you about the fact that, now those two terrorists are in Lebanon. What could the Interpol do? What could Bulgaria do, or the countries involved in the international investigations? Could they ask Lebanon to give them up?
They have, and they should, and now the question is about enforcing that. Bulgaria has an opportunity now to really try to provide a measure of justice, because right now the justice is on paper and not in reality.
You also had a follow-up policy brief about the role of ammonium nitrate used by Hezbollah in Europe. This is a big deal. It must be terrifying for these countries. Tell us more about this very important development.
I think it may seem on the one hand to be a little bit esoteric. Why write something about ammonium nitrate, right? But I think perhaps because of the port of Beirut explosion that happened in August became known. I should just mention that the explosion just devastated the country, both physically and economically, and caused, I think the numbers are up to about 200 individuals were killed, and countless more have had their homes and businesses devastated. But people will remember that attack was caused by about 3,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate, right? So I wanted to take a look, what is ammonium nitrate really, and what is its connection to Hezbollah? So this really served as a reminder to people about the role of ammonium nitrate. So I mentioned that the ammonium nitrate was used in the Bulgaria bombing, the Burgas bombing. And I also mentioned that Cyprus had found large quantities of ammonium nitrate stored in the country that was definitively found to be purchased and so-called safeguarded by Hezbollah for several years. Now, there are other cases too, and one that I've been tracking for quite a long time is one that happened also on July 18th, just like the Burgas bombing happened on July 18, 2012. The bombing in Argentina took place on July 18th in 1994, and Hezbollah was found to have carried out that bombing using about 300 tons, or the equivalent of about 600 pounds of the explosive. And in that bombing, 85 people were killed and hundreds were injured. And I'll just mention one other country, even though there are many, not only in Europe, but elsewhere in Asia, Thailand, and elsewhere. In recent months, German officials publicly confirmed that they found stockpiles of ammonium nitrate in southern Germany, also stored by Hezbollah operatives. And so I just wanted to kind of connect the dots for readers.
Did you just say that the AMIA bombing was also done by the ammonium nitrate that was used?
It was about 600 pounds of ammonium nitrate.
So there's a history of Hezbollah using specifically ammonium nitrate in all of its terrorist activities.
Certainly in many of them. It's, as I called it at the beginning, their explosion of choice.
That's very important, I think, for people to know. I don't think a lot of people know that connection of how Hezbollah has a history of using the same chemical component that was exploded in the Beirut port, killing so many people as well. What about the French position? I wanted to ask you, Toby, about Macron. He visited Lebanon a couple of times since the major explosion in Beirut. He had some tough words to say about Hezbollah, yet he continues to claim that there is a distinction between Hezbollah's political arm and military arm. What are your thoughts on the French position on all of this?
Without a doubt there is. And by the way, I should mention also, just coming back to Germany for 1 second. So Germany ended up designating Hezbollah as a terrorist entity in April of this year. And I have to think that finding this stockpile of ammonium nitrate in southern Germany has something to do with the timing of their designation, because it went beyond protests and propaganda and those sorts of things. When the Germans found the stockpile in southern Germany, I think they felt it was a responsibility of theirs to take further steps. And so, yeah, the French have a long history of support for Lebanon. As you mentioned, that goes back many years. And so its support for Lebanon, frankly, is not surprising. The question really is what's best for the people of Lebanon moving forward, right? Is it to fully and finally insist that the Hezbollah stranglehold over the country be released and to allow Hezbollah to maintain this systemic role? I think it's actually time for France and others to listen to the people of Lebanon who, Hevi, you reported on this quite a bit. The people of Lebanon have made clear what their position is through their through their protests in the streets for so long. And I think it's time for France to openly acknowledge what many other countries have acknowledged, which is that Hezbollah itself is a destabilizing force. And until it removes its chokehold on Lebanon, that Lebanon will not be safe and its people won't be free.
So do you see any similarities between these attacks, in your opinion, by Hezbollah?
There are. We talked about some of them already. We talked about the Burgas bombing and that some of the other attacks used ammonium nitrate. And first of all, I think it's important to state clearly that Hezbollah was the mastermind of these attacks, in addition to ammonium nitrate being used. I would also say that Interpol has red notices in the Burgas and Argentina cases both, and the culprits have evaded justice. But again, it's not too late to reverse that. And I would just say that Interpol should increase its efforts to work with local authorities to apprehend the culprits in both of these cases. Now, I want to mention something else. What else is similar? So the Burgas case is similar in one respect to Operation Cedar, which was a multi-country investigation into a massive money laundering and trafficking case in Europe, focused in Europe, not exclusively Europe, but basically in Europe. And a French court made convictions, and it's clear that Hezbollah was involved. And yet, again, Hezbollah here, like the other cases, well, certainly like the Burgas case, was not mentioned, right? And so Hezbollah is evading accountability. I would say briefly the same is true in many respects to the Hariri Tribunal. It was clear that Hezbollah operatives were involved, but the organization itself got off scot-free. And just because Hezbollah was not punished doesn't lessen the threat, right? On the contrary, it makes it greater since it's operating with impunity in these cases. So these cases have several things in common. And I would just add one more thing, which is the role of Iran. Now, Hezbollah was used as a proxy for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran provides an estimated $700 million to Hezbollah annually, and more money is raised through narco trafficking and other illicit activities. And Iran sees this as part of their determination to export their revolution and their ideology. But the real thing that they have in common, Hevi, is that the victims have not seen real justice.
Yes, very important thing that people in the world needs to look at. In most reportings, Toby, they only refer to 2 or 3 countries. including the United States and Israel, that have designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, how many actually have designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization?
There are actually a lot, and I think that the momentum for designating Hezbollah is growing. So to date, we have, of course, the United States, Canada, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Kosovo, Israel, Bahrain, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Now in Latin America, we mentioned Argentina, Paraguay, Honduras, Colombia. All of these have formally designated Hezbollah. And there are a couple of other ones like Lithuania and Serbia, which have announced their intents. And also we've seen reports that Switzerland is also considering doing so. It's just a question of time. Now, I should also mention that the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League have also designated Hezbollah. And I would just argue that it's time now for Bulgaria and Cyprus to do so, and sooner rather than later, don't you think?
Of course. I mean, it's very interesting that Bulgaria and Cyprus, two countries that Hezbollah has obviously been very involved in Bulgaria committing a terrorist attack, that they haven't done that yet after the trial.
And unlike certain countries which don't have a mechanism, a legal mechanism to do so, for example, Argentina did not have a legal mechanism to do so, and it took them figuring out how to put that in place. And of course, now they have that in place. But Bulgaria has that in place, and they have Al-Qaeda, they have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they have many other entities and individuals on their terrorism list.
You briefly also mentioned Hezbollah's attacks on the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Argentina. You have written extensively about this attack. What is the status of that terrorism case?
There are many, because it's a very interesting case, but maybe I'll just highlight a couple of things. First of all, Interpol has read notices for 5 Iranian officials, including some very senior leaders who still, they were leaders at the time, and several of them are still engaged in the Iranian government today. These need to be affirmed and enforced. You know, last summer, around the 25th anniversary of the AMIA attack, I did some research and I found that 20 countries have permitted either people who have red notices, either the Iranians that I just mentioned with red notices, or some Iranian officials also have Argentinian international arrest warrants. So 20 countries since the attack have permitted these individuals entry into their country. That kind of makes a mockery out of the Interpol red notices. They don't need to just be there on paper, on a website. They need to be fully enforced. Now, another aspect of the investigation of that case has to do with Alberto Nisman, who was the lead investigator for about a decade. Alberto Nisman was found dead with a bullet to his head the day before he was due to present evidence that then President Cristina Kirchner, and now Vice President of Argentina, sought to absolve Iran of its role in the bombing. Now, the investigation into his murder is ongoing, but it's hard to imagine that with Kirchner as Vice President, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And I would just say that the case against Kirchner herself, right, for these allegations that I just mentioned is in the courts. But again, with her as Vice President, it's a little bit hard to imagine that she's not going to put her thumb on the scales of justice there. Now, on the positive side, 25 years to the day after the AMIA bombing, Argentina designated Hezbollah, right? 25 years to the day, they designated Hezbollah as a terrorist entity. And this happened on the watch, of course, of the prior administration, not of the administration of Cristina Kirchner right now. So several countries followed suit after that, and I expect several others to do the same. So these are just a couple of updates on where the investigation is today.
Mm-hmm. And other countries would be in South America, right?
Other countries in South America, like Paraguay and Honduras and Colombia, followed suit. And I'm hoping, yes, I understand your question. I'm hoping that there are other countries in Latin America who have said that they will follow suit, and I'm hopeful that they will.
What does it mean when these countries designate Hezbollah a terrorist organization, knowing that there's the drug carteling and all of the other criminal activities that Hezbollah does in this part of the world. What does that mean for Hezbollah when they do this?
It means that they can raise money and move money if they're not designated. If they are designated, that means law enforcement is going to use its resources, working sometimes alongside the U.S. government, sometimes not. It will deter them from basically being able to fund and recruit and engage in these criminal activities, sometimes by themselves, sometimes alongside cartels.
In your opinion, what are the lessons for law enforcement today on the Hezbollah cases?
So that's kind of my favorite question, because court cases shouldn't end, with a verdict, right? There are lessons to be learned. First, I would just say that Alberto Nisman didn't just investigate what happened on that terrible day, July 18th, right? His investigation was granular into how Iran recruits and radicalizes and uses cultural centers and religious institutions to do that. His investigation showed how they raised money and used embassies, the Iranian embassies in Latin America, to support their terrorist activities, and how Iran uses its proxy, Hezbollah, to carry out these attacks. So the lessons are, I would say, that justice requires determination and perseverance, and it requires a great diligence to make sure that one looks really at the full picture, not just what happens on that one day. And some of the folks that were involved in the AMIA, as I mentioned, are still going at it today in Latin America, for example, elsewhere too. And so Iran and Hezbollah are hoping that we're going to get tired of pursuing justice. But the greatest lesson is that we don't get tired and that we do pursue it. I mentioned 25 years to the day, Argentina designated the very entity and the people involved who were so integral in the bombing itself 25 years prior. So a measure of justice, even 25 years later, was had, but we're not finished yet.
And you, Toby, and you guys at the FDD doing a great work shedding light on this important story that is also affects our national security. In your opinion, Toby, how could the U.S. be more active in tightening up the ropes on Hezbollah's operations in South America and other parts of the world that would include terrorist activities, but also drug trafficking and other criminal activities as well?
So law enforcement has to aggressively pursue the culprits, no matter how long it takes. And we've got to use every tool available to hold them accountable. Actually, this is a good opportunity to congratulate, really, the Department of Justice for issuing a Rewards for Justice announcement that encourages citizens to help locate one of those involved in the AMIA bombing. And this is the kind of thing that can be used and has been used in other parts of Hezbollah's malign activities. Countries should not permit the accused to travel in their country with impunity. Now, further designations of Hezbollah would also be deterrent, I think. Justice is not about memory. It's really about accountability. And designating Hezbollah is not going to bring back the dead, but it will be one small step in holding the organization and its leaders accountable. And if I could, Hevi, I just want to read something that I found again this morning. I'd frankly forgotten about it. And that's the Washington Post editorial that followed the attack just a couple of days later, because it's so poignant. And part of the editorial said, the bombing in which this was about the Burgas bombing, not about the AMIA bombing, but just as we're thinking about justice. The Bulgaria bombing in which 5 Israelis were killed was the 9th plot pinned on Iran this year and the 3rd this month. A statement by the UN Security Council on Thursday said, any acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable regardless of their motivation. The victims of the Bulgarian bombing were not warriors or scientists building illicit weapons of mass destruction, but innocent civilians, including a pregnant woman. But the international response to Iran's terrorism should be far more vigorous than it has been so far. Despite strong evidence linking Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to the attacks, even some countries whose territories were invaded by the terrorists have hung back. If Iran suffers no consequences from the acts of terrorism, they will continue. The Security Council should review the abundant evidence of involvement by the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah in this year's attacks and punish both those groups, as well as the Iranian government, with sanctions. And that's the end of the Washington Post editorial. And I think it's a reminder of things that can be done and should be done, holding Hezbollah accountable, but also its major donor, its major funder, the government of Iran.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday talked about how Hezbollah has stockpiles of weapons in neighborhoods that are full of civilians. And he pointed out exactly where those stockpiles are. What should the American response be to this, and from other countries, knowing that this is the mechanism Hezbollah uses, which is hold civilian hostages, basically?
What the Prime Minister reminded us and presented evidence for the world to see is exactly where these 100,000 to 150,000 rockets, precision-guided missiles, and other weapons were being hid. They're being hid in churches, in people's homes, in schools, in sports arenas, and others. They're being hid, I should say, in civilian areas. Now, that's called using human shields. Using human shields is against every international law. Nikki Haley spoke about it at the United Nations. Congress passed a law supported by both the House and Senate, underscoring the illegality of human shields and providing additional authorities for the US government, for the Treasury Department in particular, to designate those who are responsible for placing those rockets, missiles, weapons behind civilian populations. And so I would just say that this is not a Democratic or Republican thing. This is not a conservative or liberal thing. This is not an American thing. This is something that puts the Lebanese population at peril. And it's time that the world take it seriously.
Thank you so much, Toby Dershowitz, for joining me today. I would love to have you on again soon.
Thanks very much, Hevi.
Thank you so much all for listening and watching. With you, Hevi, in The Untold, and I'll see you next week.